Con tu propuesta serían 70 abstracts y sé que vamos a recibir el 71 de 6 diferentes países.
Nice and very exciting to see so many people in the room today. Andy and I should have ordered more pizza. But we're super excited to start the spring 2023 semester off with our Friday Forum series. For those that are unfamiliar, this is sort of the PhD students of the urban planning program. This is sort of our flagship event that we do. We try to do at least once a month during each school semester. And yeah, this is our kickoff event for this year. And we're really excited to have David López-García present on his new book, Worker Mobility and Urban Policy in Latin America. I'm going to let him introduce himself. And before he jumps into his presentation, I just wanted to highlight that we have a few more Friday Forums planned for the spring. The next one after this is going to be on March 10th, and a few of us PhD students are going to be presenting our work. We're actually practicing for some conferences coming up, so feedback would be super helpful and welcome. And then, so final date to be determined, but late March, early April, we're going to be having a visiting PhD student from across the pond be presenting some of his research on the financialization of real estate projects in UK. And then Monday, April 10th, so different, not Friday, but a Monday forum, will be Laura Wolf-Powers presenting on her new book, University City, History, Race, and Community in the Era of the Innovation District. So full menu of things coming up already, so we're excited to have all that happening.
Can you hide this?
Hopefully, yes, I can figure that out. But let me go ahead and pull up David's presentation really quickly. And then hopefully, let's just sort of like go off screen. I never know how to like actually. Yeah, I'm not very good at technology.
Maybe it'll
go away.
Otherwise, I don't think it's going to be like.
You don't think it'll be too bothersome? Okay, let me just check this chat really quickly. Okay, that seems all good.
Okay,
take it away.
Well, first of all, thank you to the Doctoral Student Association for organizing this book talk. I'm David López-García. I'm the Bridge to Faculty Postdoctoral Research Associate that started this academic year in the urban in UPP. And I basically work on urban economic development concentration. Broadly speaking, I look at accessibility to jobs in urban regions, right? Like my work is driven by the question of who has access to which kinds of jobs in urban regions and why, right? And to answer that question, I have to look at a bunch of things, right? I have to look at economic geographies and concentrations of jobs in cities. I have to look at the distribution of housing and where do workers live throughout urban regions. And I have to look a little bit at transport and how do workers connect from their place of residence to their place of work. And I have to look at issues of labor markets and discrimination in labor markets and so on and so forth, right? Over the last 4 years or so, I've been working in this agenda through the empirical study of the journey to work, right? Like as an empirical object of study, because the journey to work is very telling about different parts in this relationship, right? The origin of the trip is telling of housing patterns and where do workers live. The destination of the trip is telling of economic geographies and the location of jobs and where do workers work and why. And the trip is telling of transport policy, right? And some characteristics of that journey to work. So within that context, I authored this book that is titled like this, right? Worker Mobility and Urban Policy in Latin America, Policy Interactions and Urban Outcomes in Mexico City. I have these copies. I'm going to need the back. I'm sorry, these are the only ones I have, but I'll just hand it around. for everyone to take a look at it. And what I'm going to do now is, this is going to be kind of like a sales pitch, right? I want to invite everyone to read the book. Good news is that the book is already available in the university library, right? The ebook is available, so you don't have to spend anything. You know, Routledge is very expensive in their hard copies books, so but no one has to spend any money here. All right, so this is the outline of the talk. This was working just a minute ago. All right, no problem. Thank you. Oh, there it is. So this is the outline of what I'm going to present, and I'm going to try to do this as fast as possible so we have enough time for discussion, right? I'm going to do a very brief overview of the book. Then I'm going to highlight the relevance and the main contributions of the book. I'll do a very brief description of the chapters, but then I'm going to stop a little bit in chapter 5. I want to explain a few aspects of this chapter titled Housing Pathways and the Mobility Experience of Workers. And then we'll open it up to Q&As, right, and have a discussion about the book. So a very brief overview of the book. This was my doctoral dissertation that got edited into a book. I spent like a year after I graduated from the PhD program putting it together with Routledge. It's 133 pages. I was a little disappointed of that. I wanted more pages, but anyway, I think Routledge is like they do a really good job of packing everything like super compact, right? So anyway, the 7 chapters is one annex, is one postscript about what does it mean to do research on the journey to work in amidst the COVID pandemic, right? So that was a nice thing to add to the book. 14 maps, 12 tables, 11 figures. I did some preliminary work, field work for the book in the summer of 2016 and 2017. I spent those summers in Mexico City just trying to get a flavor of the city and like identify what I was going to be writing about in my dissertation. And then I did the field work for the book. In the fall of 2018, I did a research stay at the Mexican National Autonomous University. And then I came back in the spring break in the summer of 2019 for just a few pieces of information that I was missing. And in total, the book is based on 64 in-depth interviews with like half of them with urban development experts in Mexico City and half of them with residents of the area of study that I'll explain in a minute. I did 4 focus groups with residents of my area of study, and I did a lot of statistical and spatial analysis. The relevance and the main contributions of the book, in a nutshell, what I'm trying to do with this book is to advance the field of urban policy as a policy domain. So what I'm arguing in the introduction of the book is that contemporary urban analysis is based on a silos approach, right? Mainly based on a silos approach, like people in housing think about housing, people in transport think about transport, people in economic development think about economic development. But urban policy is weird in the sense that all of these policies overlap in urban space and interact in complex ways, right? Often producing unintended consequences. And what I'm arguing is that in the field of urban policy, we usually conduct our analysis borrowing the analytical lens from the field of public policy, right? So there's an array of analytical lenses, very useful, and many theories of the policy process and so forth, but they're not really equipped to deal with the complexity of this spatial interaction in cities, right? So what I'm trying to do here is to develop an analytical lens inspired by and designed specifically for the study of urban policy, which is another main contribution of the book, something that I titled the Policy Interactions Framework, right? A framework that provides an analytical lens to do an empirical investigation of how policies from seemingly distinct policy silos actually overlap in urban space and interact in complex ways, right? So this framework is designed to observe empirically how the outcome of the policy process in one of those policy silos will have a feedback loop into the policy process in a seemingly distinct policy silo, right? Specifically in this book, I'm looking at the interactions between economic development, housing, and public transport, but the framework is designed to look at any kinds of interactions, right? I apply this framework to the interaction between jobs, housing, and transport in Mexico City, right? So it is in that interaction where I situate my empirical study, and then comes the third contribution of the book, which is an original contribution to the literature on urban accessibility, something that I call the choiceless mobility hypothesis, that I define as the process through which the interactions between these seemingly distinct policies, economic development policies, housing policies, and transport policies, consistently increase the commuting cost for workers, right? It's a process. So I'm not going to go into more detail of this right now because I'm inviting everyone to read the book, right? This is explained in the introduction where I problematize, where I explain the relevance of the book, and I explain the methods and the main results. And in a nutshell, I explain the contributions of the book. Then in chapter 2, I develop the policy interactions framework. I draw on urban political economy and policy feedback theory to put together this framework to look at how different policy silos interact. And then in the concluding chapter, I look at all the empirical work of the book that I'll explain in a minute, and I apply this policy interactions framework to all the empirical work in the book, and I propose the choiceless mobility hypothesis, right? So just some context, this is the case study of the book. I'm looking at the whole Mexico City metropolitan region, right? A gigantic region of 22 million people comprised of 76 different municipalities in 3 different states. And I do a lot of analysis of the entire region, but I center my analysis in a case study, this one here, this area that I call Eastern Mexico City Metropolitan Zone, that you can see here. And I chose that area because it's famously a dormitory city where people have to go to the central city to work, and with very little transport, and with very particular housing pathways. And people struggle a lot in this area. Alan, Pepe, you're from Mexico City, maybe you know this area very well, right? It's also like a part of it is from the state of Mexico, and a part of it is from Mexico City proper. So there's 2 different jurisdictions. So there's a lot of institutional complexity there in how to develop policies in this area. And also the regional analysis that I do is mainly to like do an assessment of what is going on in this area compared to the rest of the region, right? For instance, this is a map of socioeconomic status of the city. I did a factor analysis with some indicators, and then I put that together, and we can see that high socioeconomic status goes to this side of the urban region, and my area of study is mainly medium and low socioeconomic status, right? With very little transportation networks. These are the mass transport networks. All right. All of this is very well explained in the introduction if someone wants to check it out. So then I said chapter 1 is the introduction, chapter 2 develops the analytical framework, and then I do a series of empirical chapters, right? So in chapter 3, I mapped the mobility situations of workers in Mexico City just to assess inequalities in the mobility experience of workers. So I do empirical study of data about the journey to work with an origin destination survey of 2017. And I basically replicate a methodology proposed by Niedzewski and Bochman in 2014 for the identification of something called the mobility situations of workers. I think I presented this in my job talk last April, right, Josh? And it's basically producing 4 categories of mobility situations, looking at commuting time and commuting distance in journey to work, right? And identifying the short commutes, the long commutes, the wormholes, people that live far away, but they have a very short commute in terms of time, and the transit hells, right? These blue areas here, people that live relatively close to their job, but they just take so much time to get there, right? So they're close, but they take a lot of time. So I developed a methodology and I map these. If anyone is interested in taking a closer look at this, the chapter 3 explains all the methodology and all the details. Chapter 4 looks at the spatial shifts in the demand for labor in a 20-year period. So in this chapter, what I do is that I identify shifts in employment subcenters and job concentrations between 1999 and 2019, right? To identify if the location of jobs has shifted and what does that mean for accessibility and workers' mobility, right? So it's an empirical study of change in employment subcenters in the metropolitan region. I do this study based on micro data from the 1999 to 2019 economic census with an analysis of total employment at the census tract level. And I basically replicate a methodology, a very well-established methodology for the identification of employment subcenters called double threshold, developed by Giuliano and Small in California in 1991, right? So I replicated and yeah, the overall result of this chapter is that even though the metropolitan region did produce more employment subcenters in this 20-year period, all of them keep overlapping towards the center and the western part of the metropolitan region, and none of them in my area of study, right? So the area of study is not producing job concentrations, employment subcenters, and then I ask the question of why. Each chapter takes a look into the policies that would possibly explain these outcomes, right? So that's also part of the chapters. I'm going to skip chapter 5 for now because I'm going to get back to it, but let me just say a word about chapter 6. So there was one chapter for jobs. There was another chapter for the mobility experience. This is a chapter for mobility resources, right? And I call it the spatial distribution of public and common mobility resources. So it's the chapter on transport. And what I do in this chapter is that I analyze and map the private and public nature of mobility resources. Mobility resources defined as all the infrastructures that allow workers to move from one place to another. And I use an analytical framework from the field of economics, right? The level of excludability and rivalry of consumption of mobility resources. And then I classify different mobility resources in the metropolitan region in 4 categories: private, public, club, and common mobility resources. And then I map them, right? Let's say that ideally we would like to see a very even distribution of public mobility resources, right, that are not rival and are not they're not excluding anyone from consumption. or common mobility resources that even though they're rival, no one can be excluded from consumption through the mechanism of price. And then I map them and I get these kinds of results, right? So for instance, the darker blue areas here are the census tracts of the city above the average, both in public and common mobility resources. So those are the best areas, right? They're very well provided with publicly funded transportation systems. And the gray areas, right? Everything that is in gray are below the metropolitan average in both the public and common mobility resources. So those are the worst areas of the city in terms of publicly funded mobility resources. But then, to my surprise, oh well, maybe it's not even a surprise, the very well provided areas tend to overlap with existing employment centers, right? And then I do an analysis of the policies that might explain this outcome. All right. More details of all this methodology and the results in the chapters, right? Let me stop in this one for a few slides. Chapter 5. This is a chapter that I wrote after graduation. After the dissertation, I did a little bit more field work and analysis, and this is a new addition to the book, right, beyond the dissertation. And I call it Housing Pathways and the Mobility Situation of Workers. And basically, I have a dialogue here with the mainstream model of residential location, right? In this chapter, I deal with the origin of trips with the residential location of workers. And, you know, the mainstream model from the classical economics will assumes that households decide their residential location by participating in housing markets with freedom of choice and without coercion and perfect information and so on and so forth. But there are many circumstances that undermine the freedom of choice assumption in navigating these housing markets. And this is especially the case in cities of the Global South. So I put forward this claim in this chapter. I hold that the workers' residential options are bounded by pre-existing default housing pathways from which they cannot escape. And that these default housing pathways, they partially determine their mobility experience, right? So workers might work somewhere, some job concentration somewhere in the city. That's half of the equation. The other half of the equation is where do they live? And they have so very little options of housing that their mobility experience is also explained by the choices in the residential location, right? So analytically, I work with the concept of housing pathways, right, which is analytical lens to for the study of the housing routes that households and individuals take over time. And there's a whole literature on this. It's a very well-developed analytical lens that assumes that these moves are strategic and that households make these decisions through time, and that we can arrive at ideal types of housing patterns, right? Like if we do an empirical analysis, we can identify ideal types. And I also work with another concept called housing forms of production. This comes from England, but this comes from Latin America, from Mexico and Colombia, right? This is a Latin American lens developed by Samuel Jaramillo from Colombia and by Professor Marta Stenger in Mexico City. And they basically argue that in capitalist economies, there's a coexistence of different forms or system of production and circulation of housing. And these housing forms of production are systems of relations where many actors participate with different roles, right? So there's many agents that participate in the production and circulation of housing, but they all have different roles in this process. Basically, there's 4 roles in the forms of housing production. There's direct labor, right, which means well, putting the labor, putting the work to build the housing unit. There's technical control of production, which is directing the labor process, right? Like the know-how of how to build the housing unit. There's direct economic control of production, which is initiating the production process by putting the money, keeping the economic control of the housing unit. And there's indirect economic control of production, which is having an influence on the process of producing housing units from outside of the production process, right? I explain all of this carefully in the chapter. Probably the chapter does a better job of explaining this than me right here. And based on these different roles, Jaramillo and Stenger put together they hold that in Latin American housing, there has been traditionally 4 main types of housing production. The first one is self-construction, right, where a household keeps the direct labor and the technical control and the direct economic control of the production process. And this housing unit is not for the market, this is for self-consumption. So it's not about the exchange value of the housing unit, it's about the use value of the housing unit, right? And here we see all kinds of construction, right? Like people using very good materials because they have money to do that, that's fine. But also using cardboard or other kinds of things because they want to lower the cost of the housing unit and so on and so forth. All right. A second type of housing production is production by commission, where this is still not for the exchange value of the housing unit. This is still for the use value of the housing unit. It's not for the market. Here, the people that are going to own the housing unit keep the direct economic control of the production, but they hire the direct labor and the technical control of production to another actor, right? Like whoever in the neighborhood knows how to build a house, they hire the production to that person. Still not for the market, it's still not for profit, but then enter a third type of housing production, private developer production. This housing unit is intended to be on the market. The motivation is the exchange value of the housing unit, and there's a capitalist here, right? So the capitalist keeps the direct economic control of production and hires the technical control of production and the direct labor to another capitalist. And then they put the housing unit in the market and they sell it for profit. And there's a fourth type of housing production, the state promotion, they call it like that, which is when the government, right, from different levels, wants to have an influence over the process of producing housing units through policies. And this gets messy because there might be many different policy instruments that the state might use to produce, to foster the production of housing, right? Either to direct provision of housing instead of on land and financing the production, or acting as a bank and loaning money for developers, or subsidizing credits for consumers, and so on and so forth. So based on this analytical framework, I asked this question, right? So what is the relationship between housing pathways available for workers in my area of study and commuting costs for residents, and the commuting costs for residents? So I go back to my field work. I take 25 interviews with residents of the area of study and for focus groups, and I analyze them again through a memoing strategy, right? Like looking all those interviews through this analytical lens. And this is what I found. This is what I put forward in the chapter, right? That there's three types of relationships between housing pathways and the commuting experience. This says mobility experience based on the use value of housing. Can we maybe move this here? Please, I think that's going to be more useful. Thank you. All right, perfect. Thank you. I think that's more useful. So this is a mobility experience based on the use value of housing, right? So it's a very simple diagram where in the y-axis I graph commuting costs, right? Low commuting costs, high commuting costs, and I identify ideal types, right? So I'm just gonna say them very briefly here, but the chapter explains them in depth. So in this scenario, let's say that some families, they live with their parents, with their grandparents, so they rent. But then they buy a plot of land and they engage in self-construction. And because land in peripheral areas is cheaper, they have to go farther away from job concentration, right? So just by having access to that housing unit that they buy for themselves and engaging in self-construction, they increase their commuting costs, right? Because they might not change job immediately. They still have to work in job concentrations. But then there's another situation, maybe they change jobs. So instead of going to the job concentrations, they engage in some kind of economic activity within the community that they bought the plot of land. Even though that might be informal economic activity or, lower wages because it's less productive economic activity. At the very least, they lower their commuting costs. And then there's also many cases where people that moved to peripheral areas became local entrepreneurs, right? And they start to put in different kinds of retail spaces or shops or workshops in these peripheral areas. They improve their economic situation and they keep their commuting costs low, right? The second ideal type of relationship, I call it the mobility experience based on the national housing policy. Some context here, the chapter explains this in depth, but some context, many reasons that are complex to explain right now. The housing policy in Mexico tends to send workers to peripheral areas, right? The problem is that having access to the national housing policy is tied to having a formal job. And the formal jobs tends to be located in the job concentrations in the center and the west of the metropolitan region. But the housing units produced through this policy are in peripheral areas and mainly in the eastern part of the metropolitan region. So the housing policy is just increasing the physical separation between workers and jobs, right? All right, so then within that context, I propose other scenarios. Again, a family might be living with their parents or grandparents or renting closer to their jobs, which lowers their commuting costs. But then when they have access to one of those social interest housing units, they're usually in peripheral areas. So just by moving there overnight, they increase their commuting costs. And they have another alternative, right? They could eventually they change jobs to something closer to the neighborhood where they moved in peripheral areas that lowers their commuting costs. Or many people move back with their parents, grandparents, or renting, and they just abandon their housing units. This is a big problem in Mexican cities right now. There's many national housing policy housing units abandoned, and people just getting back because they want to reduce their commuting costs, right? That situation is just unbearable. All right. And then there's a third ideal type of relationship that was surprising in the findings. This has to do a little bit less with housing policy and has to do more with education and access to primary labor markets, right? I call this mobility experience based on access to primary labor markets. The thing is that residents in my area of study, right, this peripheral area, dormitory city, as generations go by, right, second generation, third generation, they're getting very good educational attainment, very good credentials and diplomas. So they have access, they increasingly have more access to primary labor markets. But the problem is that they're located in the job concentrations in the center or the other side of the metropolitan region, right? So there's a paradox there that having access to better paid jobs in better labor markets comes at the cost of increasing their commuting costs and worsening their commuting experience, right? So again, in these situations, these mostly young people live with their parents, grandparents, or rent. And just by getting access to better labor markets, they increase their commuting costs. A few of them are able to move and rent closer to a job, but to my surprise, very few people do this for many reasons, right? Like land prices are really just expensive close to job concentration. So not everyone can move there. Or in some other cases is their community ties. People it's very attached to their communities and they don't want to move. Or in other cases is their social networks, right? And issues related to care, or who's going to take care of their kids. Like they rely on their social networks in the place of residence. So not everybody moves. A few do, and that lowers their commuting costs. Or people get access to one of those social interest housing units that are usually in peripheral areas, and by doing that, they increase their commuting costs, right? Again, all of this explained carefully in the chapter, and the conclusion of the chapter is that there's these default housing pathways that are producing costly commutes. I identified the emergence of these default housing pathways that are just producing a costly mobility experience in Eastern Mexico City. And these default housing pathways are produced by the interplay between existing housing forms of production, the kinds of labor markets in which workers can participate, and the institutional arrangements that determine which workers have access to which kinds of housing, right? These are a couple of photographs that I took, people trying to get to the second most important job concentration in the city called Santa Fe. This is by Auditorio Nacional. This is the line to get into one of those buses that will take you to the job concentration. Most of these people come to the peripheral areas, and people have to budget like an hour just to be in lines within their commute, right? So, this interplay between job concentrations, housing, and this kind of transport systems is constantly producing these kinds of mobility experience. That's why I call it the choiceless mobility hypothesis, because these people have no other choice. They don't have any other choice. They want to keep their jobs in these job concentrations, good jobs, well-paying jobs, but their housing units is just increasingly farther away. There's choices. Yeah, I'll leave it there. So we have time to discuss. You can get the printed version of the book here, and the ebook is already available in the library. All right. Thank you.
I'm going to repeat your questions so that people online can also hear it too. So, yeah. All right. Give me that one.
Well, yeah. So thank you. So interestingly, when you're presenting it in library of some of the segments of the work that we do in 501, when we use an allowance of the big rent period, right? In that location. So what you're offering is a very more practical, far more complex, kind of theoretical, empirically grounded theoretical conductive location theory. But I guess the question I have has to do with the better access, right? So, and it's not clear who the workers are, right? Because the choicelessness to stay far and increase their transit costs has to do with their occupation. Right, so they have a good job, but these are not the highest paid that can actually pay, that could actually. And I wonder if there's some threshold, right? Is it that either the young, and you said something about their age, but I don't know what, what the income is, what the socioeconomic composition of that is. Because I think it would be very different for the tech workers, which whoever constitutes the highest end.
Yes.
Okay, so just for the folks online, Stacy was just kind of asking clarification on who the workers are that are being interviewed and like sort of who this represents, if that makes sense, who what the occupations are.
Yeah, thank you, Stacy. That's important and that plays a role. I'm not looking at occupation in this empirical study because I'm working with a subsample of the origin destination survey that includes all workers in all occupations, right? But yes, if we took a more granular look at different occupations and economic sectors, we might start to see nuances. And that plays a role. Because you're right, like let's say people in those job concentrations in the managerial positions might earn enough to live closer to the employment center, but people in a front desk or, cleaning the building or security guards, they don't earn enough to move, so they have to live in peripheral areas. So yes, socio-occupational profile matters, and the literature pays a lot of attention to that. Something I have to say is that after this book was published, what I'm doing now is that I'm using the indicators that I produced for this work to ask other sorts of questions that I might be able to answer and engage closer to that discussion. For instance, I have a paper right now in the pipeline. It's in second review in a journal, where I ask the question of who has access to the jobs in employment concentrations, right? And I do look at socioeconomic characteristics, socio-occupational profiles, availability of transport, so on and so forth. Like what explains access to these jobs? So I'm pushing forward that question that you're saying. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. I'm really intrigued by your urban policy sort of system thinking with the three policy domains. My question, I don't really know anything about the Mexico City area. What is the land use policy context and how might that be brought in as a lens to what you're looking at? Do they use zoning, for example?
Yes, there's zoning, of course. The problem here, let me just put a map of Mexico City. Let's use that one. The problem here is one of political fragmentation, because this is Mexico City proper, and it has 16 municipalities inside of it. And this is a different state, the state of Mexico, and it has 50-something municipalities that are part of the metropolitan zone. And this is a third state, right? The state of Hidalgo with another municipality. And each municipality has their own zoning autonomy. Yeah. They decide their zoning, and there's not a lot of coordination there. And the problem is also one of, I'd say, like a dependency, right? I explain this carefully in the book and I go deeper into that, but there was a moment where there was this lock-in in terms of which areas were going to concentrate employment. And that's around the 40s. We call this a Mexican miracle. Just after the Second World War, Mexico starts with a policy of import substitutions, mainly to the United States. And it kinds of locked in where the economic activity was going to be. Manufacturing concentrates in these areas, and that's a lock-in. That has had a lot of influence
Yeah.
into attracting jobs to that zone. A little bit down the road in the 80s and the 90s, there's a economic restructuring from manufacturing and into the service sector. And for reasons that I discuss carefully in the book, the service sector concentrates here. And then in the 90s, there's a push towards a global city, right? Connecting service economy in Mexico City to global networks. And that lands here in something called Santa Fe. And also here in the center, a couple of corridors here, Reforma, Insurgente, Santa Fe. Those moments really locked in where jobs were going to concentrate. And I do discuss this very carefully in the chapter because it matters a lot.
Thank you.
Kurt.
Yeah, I really appreciated learning about the pathways you described. It really was very rich and interesting and helps me understand quite well. I'm wondering the degree to which the pathways sort of explain the increase in travel times any more than would be understood by just overall population demographics. I don't really know what they are.
Right.
So if there is simply an expanding population, if there's limited land in the center, there's going to be more development, out further out, and that would
Right.
explain some sort of percentage of
Right.
longer transit. I just what's your instinct about the degree to which these pathways explain more than the basic.
Yeah. Thank you, Kurt. That's a really interesting question. How many hours do we have? My instinct here is that demographic increase in these pathways are one and the same. Like they inform each other and they fuel each other, and could not be disembedded because precisely it's the political economy within that population increase that produces these housing pathways. For instance, it is in the 60s and the 70s that this area of study was urbanized, precisely because there's a huge population increase in Mexico City. It's in the 60s, huge population increase. Because there's a lot of manufacturing activity being developed in the city, so there's a lot of migration from inside of the country into Mexico City. But the government of Mexico City proper puts a ban to the construction of new housing units in the city. So developers have to go to peripheral areas. This used to be a lake, and developers desiccated the lake to reclaim land and produce housing units with some forms of production closer to capitalist ways of producing housing units. And that locks in as well the development of these peripheral zone here, right? But it's they're one and the same, right? Like it is the population growth that, given the political economy of land and housing, allows for the emergence of these housing pathways that then are locked in.
All right, in the peripheral zones, what is private car ownership like and how does that contribute to alleviate the choicelessness of workers?
Low, it's very low. Having a private car in Mexico City is very expensive. And it is often the case that the lower income population cannot afford a new car. They have to buy a used car. And they have to pay for repairs. And like it really is a huge percentage of a household budget owning a car. So most of the lower income population in peripheral zones opts not to have a car as a budget management strategy. And therefore they're, captive of the dependent on the public transport system. And something that I explain really carefully in the chapter about mobility resources is that at least in this area, public transport systems have been intensively commodified, right? As we can see from the map, sorry, this map here, one the other way around. As we can see in the map about mobility resources, this area lacks publicly funded transport systems. So the population has to satisfy their mobility needs in the private market. And that's another fascinating aspect of this area of study, the absence of the state in providing public transport as a common and public good. That I explained very carefully in the chapter, and I invite everyone to take a look at it.
This might be a really stupid question, but I understand what public transit is, but common mobility, like what would be can you give an example of a common mobility resource?
Yeah. Look, these characteristics of excludability and rivalry of consumption, right? Excludability means excluding someone from consuming a good through the mechanism of price.
Okay.
If you cannot pay it, you're excluded. And rivalry of consumption means that if I consume something, you cannot consume it. So for instance, this is rival, right? If I consume this Coke, you cannot consume this Coke. But this presentation is not rival. If I look at the presentation, you can also look at the presentation, and Matt can look at the presentation. So it's not rival. So I use that to conceptualize transport systems. And I say, well, if we had, let's say, a bike sharing program, free, with enough bicycles for everyone, that's a public mobility resource, right? Everyone, no one is excluded, and it's not going to be depleted. Everyone can use it, public. But if we have, as it happens, let me go back to maybe one of my initial slides here. If we have two mass transport systems that are highly subsidized, the fare is ridiculous. The fare is like 3 pesos. How much is 3 pesos? 5 pesos. It's like 25 cents.
25 cents.
The fare is 25 cents a dollar. But you cannot get into the car because it's just, let's just spend an hour in the line, right? That's a common mobility resource. It's non-excludable, but it's rival.
Right. Okay.
So those are the common mobility resources. I explained this very carefully in the chapter. And I think it's an easy read, like the way it's explained. Right. Pepe and then Rachel.
Thank you. I mean, I have a question. Like, I think the choiceless hypothesis is really interesting, and I wonder, especially with your interviews and focus group, if there's any role that perhaps social networks and family networks will be playing in these choiceless hypothesis, right? Because a lot of these settlements start because the families just go to stone settlement and then start bringing more relatives because
Yes.
it's really wild just establishing in these hills, right? And the other characteristic, and I wonder if that plays another role, is the informal nature of these settlements, right? Because some of them, these pieces of land, were occupied because there was nothing there, right? Nobody would dare to live there, and then they start building and then it's really hard to rival even the cheaper housing and property like certificates will be more expensive than no cost at all, right? Which is just occupying an informal maybe
Right.
an environmentally important zone, right?
Right.
So are these two aspects playing any role in this idea of choiceless? Because it's the only thing they know is what their families are kind of exploring and kind of pioneering in some way, right?
I think that's a wonderful entry point into keep pushing the choiceless mobility hypothesis. What are some of the underlying factors producing this choicelessness, right? I will agree with you, social networks might play a role because, for instance, here, right, you are right, Pepe. It's often the case that people got a plot of land and they start building different rooms, and all of a sudden is 4 or 5 different families living in the same housing unit, right? It's the grandfather with a couple of kids and their kids and their families. And these people, they don't have a lot of housing options, right? So they usually live in that housing unit and they help each other. They take care of the kids, they cook, like, yeah, social networks and family ties play a big role. But then they also want to get educational attainment and get a better job, right? But well, the jobs, they're not here. Imagine they get a really good job in a transnational company. It's located over here. But they cannot move because all their social networks and support for care is here, right? That plays a role. I like this thinking. I think it would be nice to start thinking about what configures this choicelessness as steps moving forward. I like it. Thank you. It's very productive.
I mean, I'd love to follow up on that. I think also it's identifying sort of what's a choice and what's sort of locked in, what's fixed, and what's dynamic. Because what I'm seeing is you're looking at the interaction between these three markets, the housing market, the labor market, and the transportation market, even though we are not necessarily accustomed to seeing transportation as a market, as much as it is a contribution or public good that is supposed to link those two things.
Yeah.
But it seems like, I don't know that, maybe it's in the book, but like the relationship, what it seemed like you were sort of assuming that commuting costs were more sort of fixed based on sort of what is, and just seeing transportation as being this kind of dynamic system, and then you've got, kind of the equivalent of, what you were just talking about, bike shares, or like some guy's got a van.
Yeah.
From the neighborhood, and he's willing to drive all the people who live in this area of the periphery to this particular manufacturing zone. But so, I just wondered to what extent I recognize that there's sort of infrastructural lock-in because of the building of transportation systems, whether there's sort of subway systems, but bus systems are relatively agile, and it does seem like there's all these sort of new forms of kind of collective mobility that keep on sort of entering into the scene. So that's one question.
Right.
Second question, kind of related, which is just a lot of people have tried to do what you're doing in terms that's simplified into like a transit score or a walk score, which seems to be kind of what you're doing by defining the mobility situations of places. I was just wondering if you looked at those kinds of abstracted indicators to determine sort of like what kind of nuance does your spatial and ethnographic analysis show that these little scores that it seems like everybody's putting in the model these days to capture. What are we losing by extracting something as complex as the mobility situation?
Thank you, Rachel. I think this is a classic dilemma of you do what you can with what you have, right? Of course, I'd love to like measure many things and capture many nuances, but like you look at what data is available in the place you're studying, and you do your best, right? You put something together that makes sense and tells you something about the place. So, for instance, in this chapter, I do one of those indexes, right? Like, pretty much like many other people are trying to develop their own indexes and measuring things. I do the same. I measured public mobility resources with sidewalks, paved roads, and street lights. They're non-rival, they're non-excludable, and it's the information I had at hand. Of course, there's many others, but I didn't have the information. And then I measured common mobility resources by selecting the transportation networks that are heavily subsidized by the government, by different governments in the area of study, right? So the subway system, the BRT system, the electric car system, the light rail system. And I measured, right, with spatial analysis, and of course, there's so much more, right? There's so many other mobility options and strategies, and but you do what you can with what you have.
But I would say it's more of a philosophical question. Is there one of these three markets that's sort of less dynamic than the other? Like, when you characterize them, if you're looking at the interactions between them, which are, you characterizing, I think, very well, that there is a fair amount of lock-in when it comes to even the labor market.
Yeah.
Location of manufacturing business, but they may not have much choice. They can't just put a factory here.
Yeah.
So kind of understanding the kind of relative choice or
Yeah.
relative degree of flexibility and dynamism in those
Yeah.
three markets that you're trying to connect. is
Yeah.
important.
I do that in the concluding chapter. I didn't present it here, but the conclusions, I do identify two interactions between the three markets, and I name them and I explain them. For instance, one of them in Kurt's point is that the population boom of the 50s, 60s, and 70s into this area produced important mobility needs for this population, and in the absence of the state, the mobility needs were satisfied by private actors that organized in like private providers of public transport. And eventually with time, they have acquired important political power and influence over the policy process. So today, it turns out that in terms of the governance of public transport, we cannot do any kind of policy in this area without engaging these private providers of public transport that are important political players that emerge due to the housing pathways and population growth, right? So that's one very specific interaction that happened here. And I explained that in the conclusions. There's one more.
What about this issue of, I don't know if you looked at these walk scores, transportation scores, and I mean, I'm not in this area, so
Yeah.
I don't know it as well, but I don't know, like, to what extent they like capture a lot of the
Yeah.
really the complexity that your analysis.
I have not had a serious discussion with all those efforts, but might be a good possibility. Like, I think there's a few questions that could be asked of how does this relate to these other efforts, right, in a more philosophical way. Right? I've not done that, but thank you for the suggestion. I think that's very useful and could be another way to move forward. Yeah.
So we've actually gone past our 1 o'clock time due to this amazing discussion.
Thank you.
But I just want to
Well, thank everyone for coming. My door is always open. Please drop by and let's keep discussing this. All right, thank you. Thanks. Great. Thanks.
That's awesome.
Good.
I have an idea for another project.
Yes. Let's discuss.
Yeah. San Francisco.
Yeah.
Put it in your head.